Oh! Hello there. Welcome. Hope you're doing all right. Thank you so much for coming back. It's lovely to have you here again. Hope your week's going well. Hope you have lots of fun, lots of interesting things happening. If not, I'm really sorry, but you're more than welcome to spend some time here. Guys, I've got a confession to make. It's not actually been a full week for me. So basically, I've got such a busy weekend. While you're watching this, I'll be chock-a-block with stuff. I might tell you about it at some point. But basically, there was no time in my schedule to do the Narnia read-through. And I was like, this is awful. We've got to do some Narnia. I can't not do one. So this is being done like 4 or 5 days in advance. So my week's going all right so far. Who knows how the rest will go. But I'm sure it'll be lovely. Yeah. But it will be busy, but fun all the same. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me. Should we crack on? So last time you were here, it was quite a scary chapter, wasn't it? Yeah, Edmund had slipped away from the conversation that the beavers and the children were having about who the White Witch was and about who Aslan was and about what the plan was to meet at the stone table. And he'd slipped away and gone to meet the White Witch at her house. And he'd gone to her house. And it was quite a scary house, wasn't it? Because it was pointy and sort of creepy. And then, of course, inside there were all those stone statues of people who the witch had turned to stone. And it was horrible to think that she had the power to do that to anyone. And then, of course, Edmund had met Morgrim, the scary wolf and the captain of the secret police, and then gone on to see the witch again, but this time had not been nearly as nice as the first time. And it was interesting to see that Edmund had started to realise that what he thought he really wanted was in fact not good for him at all and actually quite dangerous. And then, of course, he told the witch all about the plan and about how Aslan was back, and they were planning on meeting at the stone table, and this had set the witch off, and she was like, this has got to be stopped, we've got to go now. And so she said, at the very end of the chapter, make ready our sledge, as if she's going to capture the children. But we must, of course, remember 2 chapters ago that the beavers knew this was going to happen, and so they'd started to get ready to go as well. And that's where we're about to start again. So just before we start, it's interesting to look, as you have seen in the title of this video, the name of this chapter is "The Spell Begins to Break." I think that's a very apt chapter for where we are right now, isn't it? I don't know about you, I don't know where you are, but where I am, the weather has just suddenly started to turn, and of course it's almost like the witch's spell of winter is coming to an end and spring is back on the horizon, and that's a lovely feeling. I've missed the sunshine and I've missed the warmth. I'm very ready to move into this new season. Anyway, I'm rambling. Thank you so much for joining me. Take some time out of your day, get a cup of tea or coffee or whatever you'd prefer. And we'll begin. Chapter 10. The spell begins to break. Now, we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the 3 other children. As soon as Mr. Beaver said, "There's no time to lose," everyone began bundling themselves into coats. Except for Mrs. Beaver, who started picking up sacks and laying them on the table, and said, "Now, Mr. Beaver, just reach down that ham, and there's a packet of tea, and there's some sugar and some matches, and if someone will get 2 or 3 loaves out of the crock over there in the corner." "What are you doing, Mrs. Beaver?" exclaimed Susan. "Packing a load for each of us, dearie," said Mrs. Beaver very coolly. "You didn't think we'd set out on a journey with nothing to eat, did you?" "But we haven't time," said Susan, buttoning the collar of her coat. "She may be here any minute." "That's what I say," chimed in Mr. Beaver. "Get along with you all," said his wife. "Think it over, Mr. Beaver. She can't be here for 1/4 of an hour at least." "But don't we want to get as big a start as we can possibly get," said Peter, "if we're to reach the stone table before her?" "You've got to remember that, Mrs. Beaver," said Susan. "And as soon as she's looked in here and finds we're all gone, she'll be off at top speed." "That she will," said Mrs. Beaver. "But we can't get there before her, whatever we do, for she'll be on a sledge and we'll be walking." "Then we've no hope," said Susan. "Now don't you get fussing, there's a dear," said Mrs. Beaver. "Just get half a dozen clean handkerchiefs out the drawer. Course we've got hope. We can't get there before her, but we can keep under cover and go by ways she won't expect, and perhaps we will get through." "That's true enough, Mrs. Beaver," said her husband, "but it's time we were out of this." "And don't you start fussing either, Mr. Beaver," said his wife. "There, that's better. There's 5 loads, and the smallest for the smallest of us. That's you, my dear," she added, looking at Lucy. "Oh, do please come on," said Lucy. "Well, I'm nearly ready now," answered Mrs. Beaver at last, allowing her husband to help her into her snow boots. "I suppose the sewing machine's too heavy to bring." "Yes, it is," said Mr. Beaver. "A great deal too heavy. And you don't think you'll be able to use it while we're on the run, I suppose?" "Why, I just can't abide the thought of that witch fiddling with it," said Mrs. Beaver, "and breaking it or stealing it as likely as not." "Oh, please, 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 do hurry," said the 3 children. And so, at last, they all got outside, and Mr. Beaver locked the door. "It'll delay her a bit," he said, and they set off, carrying their loads over their shoulders. The snow had stopped, and the moon had come out when they first began their journey. They went in single file. First, Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, then Susan, and Mrs. Beaver last of all. Mr. Beaver led them across the dam and onto the right bank of the river, and then along a very rough sort of path among the trees right down by the riverbank. The sides of the valley, shining in the moonlight, towered up far above them on either hand. "Best keep down here as much as possible," he said. "She'll have to keep to the top, for you couldn't bring a sledge down here." It would have been a pretty enough scene to look at it through a window from a comfortable armchair, and even as things were, Lucy enjoyed it at first. But as they went on, walking and walking and walking, and as the sack she was carrying felt heavier and heavier, she began to wonder how she was going to keep up at all. And she stopped looking at the dazzling brightness of the frozen river with all its waterfalls of ice, and at the white masses of the treetops, and the great glaring moon and the countless stars, and could only watch the little short legs of Mr. Beaver going pad, 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 pad through the snow in front of her, as if they were never going to stop. Then the moon disappeared, and the snow began to fall once more. And at last, Lucy was so tired that she was almost asleep and walking at the same time, when suddenly she found that Mr. Beaver had turned away from the riverbank to the right and was leading them steeply uphill into the very thickest bushes. And then, as she came fully awake, she found that Mr. Beaver was just vanishing into a little hole in the bank which had been almost hidden under the bushes until you were quite on top of it. In fact, by the time she realised what was happening, only his short, flat tail was still showing. Lucy immediately stooped down and crawled in after him. Then she heard voices of scrambling and puffing and panting behind her, and in a moment, all 5 of them were inside. "Whatever is this?" said Peter's voice, sounding tired and pale in the darkness. I hope you know what I mean by a voice sounding pale. "It's an old hiding place for beavers in bad times," said Mr. Beaver, "and a great secret. It's not much of a place, but we must get a few hours' sleep." "Oh, if you hadn't all been in such a plaguey fuss when we were starting, I'd have brought some pillows," said Mrs. Beaver. It wasn't nearly such a nice cave as Mr. Tumnus's, Lucy thought. Just a hole in the ground, but dry and earthy. It was very small, so that when they all lay down, they were all a bundle of clothes together, and what with that and being warmed up by their long walk, they were really rather snug. If only the floor of the cave had been a little smoother. Then Mrs. Beaver handed round in the dark a little flask out of which everyone drank something. It made one cough and splutter a little, and stung the throat. But it also made you feel deliciously warm after you'd swallowed it, and everyone went straight to sleep. It seemed to Lucy only the next minute, though really it was hours and hours later, when she woke up, feeling a little cold and dreadfully stiff, and thinking how she would like a hot bath. Then she felt a set of long whiskers tickling her cheek, and saw the cold daylight coming through the mouth of the cave. But immediately after that, she was very wide awake, and indeed so was everyone else. In fact, they were all sitting up with their mouths and eyes wide open, listening to a sound which was the very sound they'd all been thinking of and sometimes imagining they'd heard during their walk last night. It was the sound of jingling bells. Mr. Beaver was out of the cave like a flash the moment he heard it. Perhaps you think, as Lucy thought for a moment, that this was a very silly thing to do, but it was really a very sensible one. He knew he could scramble to the top of the bank among the bushes and brambles without being seen, and he wanted, above all things, to see which way the witch's sledge went. The others all sat in the cave, waiting and wondering. They waited nearly 5 minutes. Then they heard something that frightened them very much. They heard voices. "Oh," thought Lucy, "he's been seen! She's caught him!" Great was their surprise when, a little later, they heard Mr. Beaver's voice calling to them from just outside the cave. "It's all right," he was shouting. "Come on, Mrs. Beaver. Come on, sons and daughters of Adam. It's all right, it isn't her." This was bad grammar, of course, but this is how beavers talk when they are excited. I mean, in Narnia. In our world, they don't usually talk at all. So, Mrs. Beaver and the children came bundling out of the cave, all blinking in the daylight and with earth all over them, and looking very frowsty and unbrushed and uncombed, and with sleep still in their eyes. "Come on," cried Mr. Beaver, who was almost dancing with delight. "Come and see! This is a nasty knock for the witch. It looks as if her power is already crumbling." "What do you mean, Mr. Beaver?" panted Peter, as they all scrambled up the steep bank of the valley together. "Didn't I tell you," answered Mr. Beaver, "that she'd made it always winter and never Christmas? Didn't I tell you? Well, just come and see." And then they were all at the top, and they did see. It was a sledge, and it was reindeer with bells on their harness. But they were far bigger than the witch's reindeer, and they were not white, but brown. And on the sledge sat a person whom everyone knew the moment they set eyes on him. He was a huge man in a bright red robe, bright as holly berries, with a hood that had fur inside it, and a great big white beard that fell like a foamy waterfall all over his chest. Everyone knew him because though you see people of his sort only in Narnia, you see pictures of them and hear them talked about even in our world, the world on this side of the wardrobe door. But when you really see them in Narnia, it is rather different. Some of the pictures of Father Christmas in our world make him look only funny and jolly. But now the children actually stood looking at him. They didn't find it quite like that. He was so big and so glad and so real that they all became quite still. They felt very glad, but also solemn. "I've come at last," said he. "She's kept me out for a long time, but I've got in at last. Aslan is on the move. The witch's magic is weakening." And Lucy felt running through her that deep shiver of gladness which you only get if you are being solemn and still. "And now," said Father Christmas, "for your presents. There's a new and better sewing machine for you, Mrs. Beaver. I'll drop it in your house as I pass." "Oh, if you please, sir," said Mrs. Beaver, making a curtsy. "It's all locked up." "Locks and bolts make no difference to me," said Father Christmas. "And as for you, Mr. Beaver, when you get home, you'll find your dam finished and mended, and all the leaks stopped, and a new sluice gate fitted." Mr. Beaver was so pleased that he opened his mouth very wide, and then found he couldn't say anything at all. "Peter, Adam's son," said Father Christmas, "Well, here, sir," said Peter. "These are your presents," was the answer. "And they are tools, not toys. The time to use them is perhaps near at hand. Bear them well." With these words, he handed to Peter a shield and a sword. The shield was the colour of silver, and across it there ramped a red lion, as bright as a ripe strawberry at the moment when you pick it. The hilt of the sword was of gold, and it had a sheath and a sword belt and everything it needed, and it was just the right size and weight for Peter to use. Peter was silent and solemn as he received these gifts, for he felt they were a very serious kind of present. "Susan, Eve's daughter," said Father Christmas, "these are for you." And he handed her a bow and a quiver full of arrows and a little ivory horn. "You must use the bow only in great need," he said, "for I do not mean for you to fight in the battle. It does not easily miss. And when you put this horn to your lips and blow it, then, wherever you are, I think help of some kind will come to you. Last of all," he said, "Lucy, Eve's daughter." And Lucy came forward. He gave her a little bottle of what looked like glass, but people said afterwards that it was made of diamond, and a small dagger. "In this bottle," he said, "there is a cordial made of the juice of one of the fire flowers that grow in the mountains of the sun. If you or any of your friends is hurt, a few drops of this will restore them. And the dagger is to defend yourself at great need. For you also are not to be in the battle." "Well, why, sir?" said Lucy. I don't know, but I think I could be brave enough." "That's not the point," he said. "But battles are ugly when women fight. And now, here," he suddenly looked less grave, "here is something for the moment for you all." And he brought out, I suppose from the big bag at his back, but nobody quite saw him do it, a large tray containing 5 cups and saucers, and a bowl of lump sugar, a jug of cream, and a great big teapot, all sizzling and piping hot. Then he cried out, "Merry Christmas! Long live the true king!" and cracked his whip, and he and the reindeer and the sledge all were out of sight before anyone realised that they had started. Peter had just drawn his sword out of its sheath and was showing it to Mr. Beaver, when Mrs. Beaver said, now then, don't stand there talking till the tea's got cold. Just like men. Come and help to carry the tray down and we'll have breakfast. What a mercy I thought of bringing the bread knife." So down the steep bank they went, and back to the cave, and Mr. Beaver cut some of the bread and ham into sandwiches, and Mrs. Beaver poured out the tea, and everyone enjoyed themselves. But long before they had finished enjoying themselves, Mr. Beaver said, "It's time to be moving on now." And I'm afraid there we're going to have to leave it. What an odd chapter. It's, they're walking along, and then all of a sudden, in this story where you've got talking animals and this, clearly well-built mythology, Father Christmas comes along. I remember the first time I read this story, I was a bit puzzled by that. I was like, Father Christmas? Really? But I think it's quite nice. When we think of joyful times, I think Christmas is one of the first things that comes into mind. And so this idea of joy coming back to Narnia with the arrival of Aslan is sort of symbolised with the return of Christmas to this land. And it's wonderful. And of course, so many people often see Narnia as a Christmas novel, because obviously with the snowy atmosphere and it's, that lamppost in the snow is such a wintry image. And then of course, Father Christmas comes along. My personal opinion is it's not a Christmas novel, but I'd be interested to find out what you guys think. Do you think this is a Christmas novel, or do you think it's not? I have my own reasons, which I'll maybe explain later down the line, but I've never seen it as a Christmas one myself. I always see it as a springtime one. But anyway, if you'd like to join us for the next time, that's chapter 11, Aslan is nearer. Oh, he is. He's getting nearer. I'm excited when he comes along and how that's going to go. But yeah, it's a fun chapter, this one, isn't it? With getting all those gifts of swords and shields and bows and arrows and the cordial with the diamond bottle. It's lovely. Oh, well, I'm feeling quite hoarse. That West Country Father Christmas. I hope you didn't mind it. But, you know, if you didn't like it, don't worry. He's not coming back. So you won't have to suffer that again. But yeah, guys, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you're having a lovely Sunday. I hope I'm having a lovely Sunday. We'll see what happens. But yeah, until next time, I hope you take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.